Today's program is supported by K2 Integrity. K2 is the premier global risk advisory firm. In an ever changing world filled with uncertainties and risk, K2 helps clients with better insights, better solutions, and better decisions. K2 Integrity. Believe in better. I'm Yaya Jata Fanusi. What is financial intelligence? The textbooks tell us it's the process of gathering and analyzing financial activities in an effort to uncover threats or criminal dealings. But financial intelligence is more than just studying bank accounts and online transactions. In order to make an impact, financial intelligence requires bold, creative action in the real world. John Cassara is a 26-year veteran of the U.S. government's efforts to take down financial criminals. He started out as a CIA case officer and later became a special agent at the Treasury Department's Financial Crime Enforcement Network, or Finsen. He's conducted investigations into money laundering, smuggling, terrorist financing, and weapons trafficking throughout Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. He even went undercover as an arms dealer during a 2-year detail to the U.S. Customs Service. He's the real deal. You'll hear from John about how he parlayed his field experience as a collector of human intelligence in the CIA into the world of illicit finance investigations. He also shares his insights into the varied states of U.S. financial intel before and after the 9/11 attacks, and how he believes the Treasury Department may have lost sight in the enforcement mission that's needed to address today's most perilous economic threats. John, I once heard you say that good financial intelligence requires good human intelligence. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. I think having good human intelligence is absolutely vital for financial crimes investigations, money laundering investigations in particular. And the reason I say that is from my years of experience. I go back to the days when I did a lot of mentoring, a lot of training overseas, particularly in the developing world, particularly, for example, the time after 9/11 when I was out providing training and technical assistance and mentoring to countries that were working to establish, for example, a financial intelligence unit that was trying to create financial intelligence for the first time. And many of these countries would say, yeah, we did it. We stood up an FIU. Now we've got financial intelligence coming in. That's it. That's all we have to do. We're going to have money laundering cases right now. And it doesn't work that way. Occasionally, you might have that case, that rare case where you have that perfect SAR or that perfect bit of financial intelligence that'll say, okay, this is the case. But experience has shown, my experience has shown, the history of money laundering investigations has shown over the last 30 years that putting a financial crimes investigation together, a complex money laundering case together, is pretty much like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. You need various pieces of the puzzle. And that could, in fact, be financial intelligence, but it could also be surveillance. It could be electronic intercepts. It could be an undercover approach. It could be commercial records. But over and over and over again, we've realized that there is no substitute for human intelligence, somebody in the inside, somebody that's recruited, somebody that's going to tell you the story, somebody that's going to explain how it works, somebody that's going to talk about the intention of the criminal or the criminal organization.
Well, John, you have had such a long, distinguished career in the government and beyond, but take us back to your early government days. You were at the CIA. What sort of work were you doing?
I was, and it's how it all started. Way back when I was recruited out of college. This was uh, actually right after the war in Vietnam. There wasn't a lot of hiring done back then. Uh, I applied to the CIA. I was going to grad school, and literally, got the number out of the phone book, applied. It was kind of a funny feeling because it was kind of the first interview I really had, job interview, And I just had this feeling in my gut that I got the job. It took a while. There was a hiring freeze on, but eventually I got the telegram, and I loaded up all my possessions, grad student. I had a sleeping bag, my interview suit, my stereo, a couple of pots and pans, put it in the back of my car and traveled across the country and reported to Langley, reported to headquarters. And much to my surprise, they put me in effect, a library. It was Office of Central Reference. And that's not what I was expecting. I thought I was going to be the next James Bond. And it was okay. And I really am grateful to have that experience as an analyst, because they did a lot of biographical analysis, looking at world leaders and this type of stuff.
Hmm.
And I enjoyed it, but I said, this is not what I wanted. So I applied to, at that time, I think it still is, called the Career Trainee Program. It was in Director of Operations. It was that elite working
Hmm.
to become a case officer. And I applied and I was accepted, and I absolutely loved it. I loved it. I mean, I couldn't believe I
Hmm.
was getting paid for this. And I went down for training and learned the intelligence cycle, the spotting, the assessing, the recruiting, the developing, learning how to do reports. And my first tour overseas, I was sent out, and it was the height of the Cold War.
Hmm.
And people, it's hard to relate today, but I mean, there was a real threat out there, and we were taking a threat extremely seriously. My mission, I was in Africa division of the DO, and there were about 30,000 Cuban troops in Angola. Cuba was a very staunch ally of the Soviets. Um, and Angola, former Portuguese colony. Um, I was sent out to Portugal to try to develop information on the Angola target, on the Cuban target, on the Soviet and their allies, the targets in Angola and Africa, and was very, very successful at it.
Right, and you mentioned the DO, so the Director of Operations, and it sounds like this is by this time, I guess the '80s, Cold War. By this time, when you're operating, and as a case officer, you mentioned targets, so you had to you had to identify actual individuals, actual people as sources. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, you could do that in a wide variety of ways. I had a lot of latitude. I was literally working the streets. I'm still not allowed to tell exactly what I was doing and what my position was out there, but I had a lot of latitude. And some of these sources, if you will, were developed from leads. I would get leads from headquarters. They say so and so is going to be visiting the country. He's going to be, or she's going to be, at this particular area. See if you can, meet this person and develop them. That I did a number of times. Sometimes it was in a network of people, a group of people that I was introduced to other people, and the target would develop. In effect, there wasn't just one way of doing it. There were a
Right.
wide variety of ways of meeting people. And then it's a question of developing these people. Of course, I was undercover, um, and you had to establish rapport and trust
Hmm.
and get to know them and assess their vulnerabilities for recruitment. What were they motivated by? Money, perhaps? Uh, were they, anti-government? Did they hate the communist system? Did they have, affinity towards the West? Whatever it was, you did that, and then you had to structure, after you were pretty sure that they would say yes and they had the access to information that we desired. You would give them the pitch, the recruitment pitch. Will you work for us? Will you work for the CIA? And in that position, I did pretty well. I had a number of really good recruitments, and then the fun part for me was after they would say yes, you get this information, and then you'd send it back to headquarters for the policymakers to help them in their decision making.
And John, that's a very unique experience, the type of experience that a lot of people have, even doing a lot of people don't have, even when looking at finance. Right? You were doing something very sort of hand to hand, in person, and on the ground. And if I'm thinking that this is the '80s, there were other threats as well. I mean, by the '80s, I know we had crime and drug cartels. Can you tell us about some of the cases or some of the targets that you worked in the '80s?
Sure. Well, I have to finish that little bit of a story by saying I had to leave the agency because I first tour. I was a young man, and I happened to fall in love with a young lady out there, and I literally had to choose between the woman I loved and the job I truly loved. And so I left the agency, and I was shopping my resume, if you will. I wanted to continue to work for the government, so I was picked up by Treasury, first the Secret Service, and then U.S. Customs. Uh, Customs, different than Homeland Security investigations today. Legacy Customs, they had a very broad mission, had everything to do with the border of the United States. There was actually absolutely there, there was the Legacy Customs Service um, mandate mission was very broad, actually enforced more laws than the FBI does. Everything with the
Mm.
border, including money and drugs and high technology and weapons and this type of stuff. So, for example, you ask about cases. One of the very first cases that I was involved with the U.S. Customs Service was violations of the Arms Export Control Act. And the reason I was asked to join customs from the agency was because the local field office, the Washington, D.C. field office, actually the Reston, Virginia field office, had a major investigation going. A friend of mine had a undercover operation targeting arms dealers, and they asked me with my background and experience if I'd like to join him. So that's the two of us. We did. For 2 years, we had a undercover front company, if you will, based in Georgetown, military armaments and communications, and that was the name of the company, and we basically used sources to let people know that we were open for discussions. And it took a while. Again, you have to establish the rapport and the credibility. But eventually, one day, we had a former Navy SEAL who was escorting a couple of South Africans working for Arms Corps, the South African munitions company, come into our office, and after a while they approached us to see if we could help them procure gyroscopes manufactured by Northrop to put on a South African missile system. And if you remember your history, South Africa was developing or had developed a nuclear weapon at the time. This is during the apartheid era. So we ran with them. It was a great case. There was money launderers from Canada that came down, and other South Africans. South African Security Service came in to check us out.
Hmm.
But after 2 years, we took this operation down. It was the first case of this nature under the Anti-Apartheid Act.
Hmm.
We busted a number of people. It made the national news. It made the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and
Hmm.
the network TV that night. And it was a really good case. But it was a good example again using intel,
Hmm.
using source development to make law enforcement cases.
Now, I was looking into the history of some of the operations in the '80s that dealt with the drug war, which we remember. I remember, the '80s was the war on drugs and just say no. But on the law enforcement side, there was a lot that people maybe didn't know. And I was reading about something called Operation Polar Cap.
Okay.
Yeah, can you tell us about that and your knowledge or involvement of with it?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great case. At that time, it was the largest anti-money laundering case in history. It was well over $1 billion in 1988, 1989 money. And the case, my involvement in the case was after my experience with that undercover case, Project Wayward, the anti-apartheid case. I was transferred to Customs headquarters, and I was put in the anti-money laundering section. Didn't know a whole lot about money laundering at the time, but it sounded like fun, and I wanted to learn, and I've been kind of doing it ever since. But again, with the government, it's being in the right place, the right time. After doing it for about a year or two, I was asked to go overseas to our embassy in Rome to head up the world's truly first anti-money laundering task force, Operation Primo Passo, or First Step in Italian, and went overseas to Rome and had this task force, anti-money laundering task force between the U.S. Customs Service and the Italian Guardia Finanza or fiscal police, looking at financial intelligence to target Italian American organized crime or the mafia, particularly looking at the monies going back and forth between Italy and the United States. That is background. When I got out there, almost immediately, we got a lot of requests coming from headquarters and others to take a look at the fallout of Operation Polar Cap. Operation Polar Cap was had just been taken down, and it involved the misuse of the international gold trade. And
Mm,
there were a lot of schemes and variations of schemes related to Operation Polar Cap, but the principal part of it, there was the a bunch of kind of renegade gold dealers in the jewelry district of Los Angeles,
mm,
particularly a lot of Armenian networks, and they would take drug dollars, uh, basically circulate them through some of these gold dealers, gold stores, gold fronts.
mm,
Ropex was one of the big ones, and then the gold companies would then deposit these drug dollars in banks, saying it was not the proceeds of crime, of course, but it was part of their business. They were
mhm,
buying, selling, trading gold, and that was the part of the money laundering, the placement and the layering. And then there were other schemes as well. They would import, say, for example, gold-plated lead bars from Uruguay,
mhm,
and then they would pay for those gold bars that were coming into the country. So there were a lot of schemes. But towards the very end of the operation, there was a guy that they videoed and taped because they had a lot of surreptitious. They had a lot. This place was the government had this place wired literally,
mm,
and there was a guy that came in. They didn't know his full name. They just knew that he was called John. He was from Milan, Italy, and that he was a person of some prestige, and everybody kind of deferred to him. And he was very much involved in this gold business. Anyway, then the case went down, but the undeveloped leads, as we called them, came out to our office in Rome, find out about this John of Milan and his involvement in Operation Polar Cap. So I spent the next 2+ years of my life learning everything there was to know about John and his operations. And it turned out it was a tremendous learning experience. Learned a great deal about the misuse of the international gold trade. It got me started in trade-based money laundering, got me started in underground financial systems like havala. And a lot of those lessons that I learned, I'm still applying to this day.
So from watching John from Milan, which is a great, great name for a mysterious criminal gold dealer, what were some of the techniques? What did you learn?
We got a lot of documents. A lot of these investigations start, obviously with documents, invoices, fictitious invoices, and trying to track these invoices down relating to the buying and the selling of gold. And a lot of this goes back to the trade-based money laundering, over invoicing and under invoicing. So I was kind of getting a foundation on how that worked. Um, there were other techniques as well. In fact, human sources. John was operating in Italy, but a lot of the leads went to the Middle East. We were a regional office in Italy. We covered something like uh, it was about 30 odd countries. So I was I'm sorry, it was more like 52 countries. I was on the road a lot to the Middle
Mm.
East, to the Gulf area of the Middle East, and I would be tracking these leads down, these invoices that originated in Kuwait or the UAE or Qatar or wherever. And along the ways, I would go back to the source development. I would try to talk to people in the industry or talk to the chambers of commerce that were kind of overseeing, the gold industry, or I would talk to the gold brokers. And I would, of course, ask about John, but at the same time, I was educating myself about the misuse of the international gold trade, the industry itself, how it worked, why gold was a favored instrument for money launderers and later terrorist financiers, talk to people in the diamond industry, et cetera, et cetera. That led me in turn to, hawaladars and import-export dealers in the Gulf. And all this stuff I was learning paid tremendous, well, dividends, or um, laid the foundation for what was going to happen at the events around 9/11.
So before we get to 9/11, just to sort of break it down, I mean, it sounds like you were able to identify clues in these operations, and the clues, it sounds like, were these invoices. So am I right in thinking that you get an invoice on what some would think is just a legitimate business deal, some sale of gold, trading gold, but that invoice would have info that would then link you to, well, the supplier, the other partners, and you sort of um I guess became an expert at this technique of using the trading system to hide money laundering. And in fact, John, I know you wrote the book on trade-based money laundering. Literally, one of your books is trade-based money laundering, and I learned a lot from that book. Um, but trade-based money laundering doesn't probably get the headlines it should. Why is it important to understand?
Because I think trade-based money laundering is probably the biggest money laundering methodology in the world, and it has been for some time, and it will continue to be so. Trade-based money laundering is very broad, as you know, Yaya. I mean, it deals with what you said. It was customs fraud, but it also deals with tax evasion and export incentive fraud and VAT fraud, value-added tax fraud, carousel fraud, capital flight, evading capital controls, barter trade, value transfer, underground financial systems, black market peso exchange, hawala, fight Chen, flying money, even what I call commercial trade-based money laundering. If you put it all together, as I said, it's the largest money laundering methodology in the world, but it's also the least recognized, understood, and enforced.
Mhm.
One of the things I can say, and you rack your mind thinking about what happened at the time, but when I was overseas and I was learning about all this stuff in the early 90s through all my travels, from Rome, going to the Middle East and elsewhere, I needed to distinguish between traditional money laundering at the time, which was basically large amounts of money sloshing around through Western financial institutions, vis-a-vis what I saw was money laundering via trade, which was uniquely a customs perspective. So I think I coined the term trade-based money laundering. At least that was in my case reports and my messaging back to headquarters. At the same time, there were two other individuals that were also working involved with trade-based money laundering that deserve mention. Lou Bach, kind of the godfather of trade-based money laundering at customs headquarters, was doing pioneering analysis, looking at trade data, and he was using a term trade-based money laundering. And there was a really smart academic down in South Florida, John Zendanowitz, who is also talking about trade-based money laundering for the first time. So this was the origin of trade-based money laundering in the early 1990s, and it's taken off today.
So the 90s, you're working cases around the world, becoming an expert in trade-based money laundering. Plus, you have your CIA experience developing sources as a case officer. And then we get to 9/11. So
Right.
9/11, as we've talked about on the show, things changed in terms of financial threats. Where were you on 9/11? And then how did your work change and what did you notice from that point forward?
Yeah, when I came back from Rome, I became the customs liaison to Treasury's Finsen, and I was doing that from about 1996, through about 2000, where I actually converted to Finsen because I was a family man, devoted family man, and I was going to be transferred. And I asked the management of Finsen if I could just stay there, and they said yes, and it worked out. Those first few years at Finsen were great because I love the original mission of Finsen. We could talk about that and how it's changed a little bit over the years. But the idea of taking financial intelligence and assisting my colleagues in the United States and around the world with their investigations, because again, particularly suspicious activity reports, they were originated in the United States about 1996, about the same time I got to FinCEN. So a lot of this was just letting people know what was available to them. But getting back to your question about 9/11, I was at FinCEN when 9/11 went down, and um, I was it still hurts to almost talk about it. I was very almost depressed because
Yes.
we started looking in all the wrong places for threat finance.
Hmm.
FinCEN at the time, it had horrible management. It flat out did. It had horrible management. And FinCEN was part of a part of the bureaucracy, the culture of the bureaucracy that you will understand. Yeah, yeah, part of Treasury. FinCEN's wanted to basically address the war on terror finance the way they did the war on drugs, meaning they
Hmm.
were convinced that financial intelligence was going to solve the problem, that we were going to find Osama bin Laden's fortune in the proverbial Swiss bank account. And I
Hmm.
was also convinced that was not going to happen. So I went to FinCEN management and said, look, we've got to look at the way our adversaries work, transfer money, transfer value. We need to look at the international gold trade. We need to look at value transfer. We
Hmm.
need to look at havala. And they didn't want to hear it. In fact, I was actually given a gag order by FinCEN management. You shall not talk about gold, for example. I mean, think about that. I mean, this was a major threat that our adversaries were using, and I was flat out not allowed to talk about it.
Hmm. Why so? Why were they not open to this line of investigation?
I think there were two reasons. Number one, I just said they were absolutely poor management, and number two, they the mandate at FinCEN, or the reason for their existence, was financial intelligence, and they were convinced that they could make that that square peg fit in a round hole. They didn't want to deviate from that. And I thought, no. I was there at FinCEN's founding. I was at customs headquarters in 1989, 1990, when FinCEN when Finsen was first formulated. It was a joint initiative between the U.S. Customs Service and the IRS. The idea, very altruistic idea, was to get financial intelligence, get it into the hands of law enforcement where they could use it.
Hmm.
It was the antithesis of the stovepiping, that everybody who talked about at the time of 9/11. It was the
Hmm.
most altruistic thing I ever saw in my government career. The original promise and potential of Finsen was off the charts, but the mission was to help law enforcement. And there was nothing
Hmm.
in that mission that said it had to revolve around financial intelligence. So if
Hmm.
we had information about trade-based money laundering or havala or gold or whatever it was, we should be able to get that out the door as well and to assist these investigations. But management didn't want to hear it.
Today's program is supported by K2 Integrity, the premier global risk advisory firm. In today's world, threats can arise anywhere at any time. Threats to your organization's operations, financial stability, or reputation. K2 offers a better way to counter the threats facing your organization and provides critical intelligence and actionable strategies to uncover the truth, make decisions, and reduce risk. K2 helps you face critical challenges with an experienced team and the ability to navigate the most complex issues to arrive at better outcomes. That's why clients partner with K2 to help them thrive in an ever changing world filled with uncertainties and risk. By providing better insights, better solutions, and better decisions, K2 Integrity. Believe in better. You mentioned hawalas a few times. Could you just break down for us what a hawala is?
Yeah, Hawala is an underground financial system, sometimes called an alternative remittance system. Sometimes people call it, underground banking. And there are a lot of sister systems around the world. For example, the Chinese flying money systems, or Hundi in Pakistan, or Undial in Sri Lanka. They're all basically the same thing. It's money transfer without money movement. So somebody wants to transfer money from one country to another, they give money to a broker, a hawaladar, and that another broker delivers that money to the ultimate destination. The money's not actually physically transferred from one country to another. The money in that end country is there.
Mhm.
Eventually, the hawaladars have to settle accounts or balance the books because value is being transferred from one country to another. So somebody's running a
Mhm.
surplus, somebody's running a deficit. There's lots of different ways those brokers settle accounts. Some
Mhm.
of it's via bank. Uh, some of it's wire transfer. Some of it depending on where it is. For example, in the interprovincial transfers in Afghanistan,
Mhm.
cash couriers are used. We're seeing cyber being used today, cyber currencies, but historically and culturally, it's trade-based money laundering and value transfer. The over and under invoicing, it's used to settle accounts between hawaladars.
So you've pointed out that a lot of times the government is behind. So the adversaries are using all these different innovative methods. They might be old methods, but they're using whatever's at their disposal. But the government or treasury at the time sees, well, this is what we did with the war on drugs. We followed the money, the bank money and the bank transactions. This is what we're going to do. So then walk us through the transition. It sounds like after 9/11 you were saying we needed to go in one direction and there was resistance. So what has happened since then? What has happened with treasury and financial intelligence?
I think a few things happened. I think we eventually learned our lessons. For example, I was in Kabul, Afghanistan. This must have been about 2005, 2006, and I went out there to help the Afghan government set up a financial intelligence unit. I was assisting some other people working with Treasury's Office of the Technical Assistance. And while I was out there, I met with the agency, I met with DEA, I met with people in the embassy, and I was asking about what are we doing regarding threat finance? And the answer was basically nothing. They weren't doing anything at that time. They weren't looking at gold. They weren't looking at havala. They weren't looking at trade-based money laundering. I was shocked, absolutely flabbergasted. Eventually, they kind of saw the light. Same thing was going on, the war in Iraq. Eventually, they realized that they had to start looking at the money, following the money and the value trails. Once they did that, in both instances, Afghanistan, Iraq, and others, kind of learning indigenous techniques, learning how our adversaries think and operate, we started making a lot of progress. But they were hard-learned lessons. Hard-learned lessons. It's something our military, dragged its feet on for too many years, and I think our intel services did as well. I think circa 2025. I think the lessons of the last 30 years are clear when it comes to financial crimes investigations. Everything hinges on enforcement.
Hmm.
We've got to get back to the basics of enforcement. You can have, 4 million SARs filed at Finsen, which is great. That's about what we do.
Hmm.
4 million SARs a year filed at Finsen, but those SARs aren't going to make a case. As I said, eventually those SARs have to be passed off to law enforcement at the federal, state, even local level, our international counterparts. And that's we're going to require investigators, special agents, for example, to take that SAR and to work the streets
Hmm.
and use the tools in the toolbox to put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle back together again. We're trying to take shortcuts. We're trying to use, analytic systems, artificial intelligence, all that stuff. And this
Hmm.
is all great, but it's still going to require enforcement.
Hmm.
And this goes back to Treasury. And what I think should be happening, I think, again, Treasury needs to learn the lesson of going back to the basics of enforcement as well. Because outside of IRS CID, whose major mission is tax enforcement,
Hmm.
Treasury no longer has an enforcement arm. It used to, but it no longer does. Treasury used to have U.S. Customs, which was, established, when about 1790 or something like that. It used to have the U.S. Secret Service, which was established right after the American Civil War, about 1865. It doesn't now.
But is there a gap? I mean, those are agencies. They are elsewhere, right? They are in different forms, restructured or under different agencies. So why are you saying that enforcement isn't happening? Don't we have enforcement agents and officers?
Well, we do, but for example, let's just take ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, which was established under the new DHS, Department of Homeland Security, right after 9/11, because Congress created DHS because they felt they had to do something after 9/11. In my opinion, it was absolute disaster. If you look at the acronym Immigration and Customs Enforcement, immigration. Well, just, look at the headlines. What's going on? Our focus is immigration, 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 and legacy customs enforcement has been shortchanged. All that expertise I've kind of alluded to, revolving around, value transfer, trade-based money laundering, the misuse of the international gold trade, legacy customs work, the transfer of technology and munitions, all this stuff that's being shortchanged for issues revolving around immigrations. You've been in the government, yeah, there's only so many resources, so many people available. And if the priority is immigration, then everything else is going to get shortchanged. How can we make these major money laundering investigations, if we don't have the people and the resources to work it? And you say, well, other agencies and departments can do it, but they're really not. For example, DEA, it's single mission.
Hmm.
DEA is narcotics. You could say narcotics money laundering, but that's it. What about all the other stuff that they're not focusing on? Or the FBI, they're they're good at what they do, white collar crime, catching bank robbers, but they don't have a clue about trade-based money laundering. That's not their mission. It is Treasury's mission. It's not DOJ's mission. It's not DHS's mission. It's Treasury's mission. And it had been for 200 years. And then they created this monstrosity of DHS, and it doesn't work. Learn the lessons over the last 20 odd years and get back to the basics of enforcement. Put the Secret Service and Customs back into Treasury, and then revitalize our financial crimes investigations, and then do it.
Well, John, I mean, speaking of lessons, I know you've written about things on the horizon, things that you've noticed. You haven't mentioned much about China, but I know you've written about China. So I'm wondering if before we leave, you could say something about CCP Inc.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Yaya. I started getting concerned about China because of my travels overseas, and I saw the expansionist Chinese threat, the CCP Inc. threat that I call in my book, overseas as part of the Belt and Road Initiative years ago. Um, I started trying to call attention to CCP's involvement with transnational crime and money laundering. So I wrote a book, came out a couple years ago, on CCP and transnational crime, money laundering. And in the book, I looked at the top 10, 12 specified unlawful activities for money laundering, things that we're all aware of: narcotics trafficking, counterfeiting, weapons trafficking, high technology, uh, uh, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, all this stuff. In almost every category, China leads the world. China, CCP Inc. lead the world. If you total up China's involvement, it totals approximately $2 trillion a year in transnational crime. 2 trillion is a significant number, particularly because experts think that the magnitude of international money laundering is roughly in the area of $4 to $5 trillion a year. So you can make an argument by looking at specified unlawful activities that China is responsible or involved with about half the money laundering in the world, but yet we never talk about it. We never talk about their involvement in transnational crime, or rarely talk about their involvement in transnational crime. Intellectual property rights violations alone, people are estimating it could be $1 trillion a year. The biggest transfer of wealth, of knowledge in human history, but we're not doing hardly anything to combat it. Um, it's a real threat, and it's something that concerns the heck out of me. The, you know, Honestly, I think if we approach this the right way, I think China's involvement in transnational crime is their biggest vulnerability. And I don't understand why policymakers don't grasp this. Maybe the new administration, the incoming administration, will look at this. But, we always think of China as a threat. It could be militarily, it could be diplomatically, it could be commercially, economically, high tech, et cetera, et cetera. And they are. But where they are more vulnerable, okay, we have put all these countermeasures out there, but we've never really successfully gone after their criminality in this country and their criminality around the world. We need to marshal our resources. Back again, we talked about the 80s and the 90s. We put these task forces together. We have task forces today, the HIDAs and the HIFCAs and this is and the that's. That's great. But we could put together, like we did back in the 1980s, task forces dealing with, say, Italian American organized crime. Put task forces together in this country in particular areas that target on the Chinese threat, the overlapping threat that deals with transnational criminality. It could be human trafficking, it could be narcotics trafficking, it could be whatever. And the methodologies, the unique methodologies that our Chinese adversaries use to launder money and transfer value. I'd love to see that happen, and I think we need also to work with certain countries around the world and to educate them and to have them join us, because it's not to do these transnational cases by definition they're international in scope. We can't just do it here in the United States. We
Yeah.
need to use our network of legats, FBI attaches overseas, network of customs offices, ICE offices overseas, et cetera, our intel presence, and work and expose what's going on, humiliate the CCP, and let people know what they're up to, how they're doing it, their money stashed away in offshore centers around the world, and let people know the extent of CCP, transnational crime, and money laundering.
Well, John, I mean, so you've given us some big threats to think about, some bureaucratic problems and lessons learned. But you mentioned there is a new administration. By the time this airs, it'll be after the inauguration. So I'm wondering if you could leave us with some thoughts about what you would say to the new Treasury Secretary. If you were, I won't say in an elevator, I'll say you're sitting at a dinner table and he's sitting next to you, and you have a chance to maybe give him some advice. What would you tell the new Treasury Secretary?
I would tell the new Treasury Secretary that part of your mandate, part of your mission is to focus on enforcement, and go back and read your history and learn about legacy customs and learn about the proud history of the Secret Service. And a predecessor, a Secretary of Treasury, basically gave up on the Secret Service and gave up on Customs Service right after 9/11, and let those proud um, agencies uh, let them go away. And history has shown that that was a major mistake. I mean, just read about what's happened over the last so many years with the Secret Service and Customs. Make a very strong play in the administration to take back the Secret Service and Customs. And once again, let those proud historical Treasury agencies thrive within the Department of Treasury once again. That's where they belong naturally. It's a great fit. See if you could rectify the mistakes of the past.
It's clear that although he is no longer in government, John Cassara still lives and breathes the mission that he founded Treasury, fighting financial crime. I get it. I myself spent a chunk of my career in the US government countering threats. Sometimes, when you're out of the fight, you gain a clear perspective on what works and what could be improved. As we begin a new year and a new presidential administration, there's likely to be much debate around how to best address financial threats. And as we map out the best strategies, we'll all be best off to listen to the counsel of former economic warriors who want to make sure we don't forget the mission. I'm Yaya Jata Fanusi, and this is Designated on the Illicit Edge Network.